Beginning current Daf, Masech the Succah Daf Chafalef, begin 5 lines Daf at the top of the Yomid, and we continue the discussion we started in the previous Daf regarding Rabbi Yehuda's opinion about what makes an oil, as we'll see as that relates back to the halacha of our Mishnah, which opened up the second parak Hayashin Tach Zamita. She corresponds because of the Mecheskel to end and that Achayim B'Shem joining us for today's Daf. This is close to Rabbi Yehuda's. Some of these we discussed in today's Daf are Rabbi Yehuda's opinion of what's considered an oil, the process by which water was collected for the paraduma. Can the temporary dwelling inside the permanent dwelling affect the status? Supporting the schach with something that can become tameh. Some important terms the concept we discussed today is about sukkah diris kebab, meaning that the sukkah, some hold, has to be a permanent structure. Sikhs have the concept that even when the Talmud Chacham is just schmoozing, is just talking, you have to learn from the words that he's saying. Oyel is the halacha that when you have a canopy of some type of a covering, as long as it's a tefach high, it conveys tumah from one end to the other end. Paraduma is the red heifer that they used to slaughter it and burn it and use its ashes to mix it with water and spray on someone who's tameh. Kever tahayim is when there's a grave that's unknown that we have a suffix of tumah. So we said in the Mishnah, Yehuda says that we used to sleep underneath the bed in front of the elders and they wouldn't say anything to us. So Yehuda says that a bed is not an oil. So the Gemara gets into a discussion regarding Rabbi Yehuda, which we started in the previous Daf and Mishnah Aleph. Rabbi Yehuda says any oil that's not made by the Adam, it's not man-made, he held is not an oil. And that's regarding the laws of Tumah, which will not transfer Tumah from one place to another. Where does Rabbi Yehuda know this? He knows from Gezer Shav on the Mishkan. By the Mishkan it says, Yifra says oil on the Mishkan. Just like by the Mishkan was man-made, so too the halach of Tumah's oil has to be man-made. The Rabban, however, we said that they hold the repetition of the word oil by Tumah. So all those extra words of oil, it comes to quote even naturally occurring shelters. That's what explains their halacha of the machlekes we said in the previous Daf. Now this is where our Gemara continues 5 lines down at the top of the Chafal from it up. Says the Gemara, Yehuda really hold kol oil she'eino asam b'adam, any oil, any canopy, any covering, any tent that's not man-made in oil is not going to be considered as an oil. As he said in the previous stuff, let's say Shrotzim had made it, or the water dug through and made a hole, that crevice is not considered oil. But remember, that seems to be contradicted from a Mishnah Masechtas Par. Mishnah tells us they had these certain courtyards that were built in Yerushalayim, agabe hasel, on top of rocks. And the area beneath the courtyard is actually hollow. Why did they dig there? Why did they make their courtyards over a hollow space? They kever tahayim. Rashi points out whenever we say the words kever tahayim, which literally means to say the grave of the depth, or tumas tahayim throughout Shas, it really means the terminology of doubt. Like the tahayim, the depth, which is unrevealed, that people just don't know what's there. So when we say the kever tahayim, we mean to say the whole city of Yerushalayim, we're really in doubt. Maybe someone was buried over there. And the problem is, the dead person does not have what's called a halal, a space of a tefach, of a handbreadth. The problem is, if you have someone that's buried or in any space that there's no gap of a tefach, of air, that's called tumrit tzutza. Tumrit tzutza means like a crouching tumah. And then, since there's no space, it actually shoots up all the way into the sky, as the Mishnah says in Olis. So, if anyone's on top of that dead person, he automatically becomes tummy because it shoots right up. So what they did was they built these courtyards on top of boulders, that even if there was a grave somewhere beneath, but there's now a halal, there's a space that's being mafsik, and the tumah is not going to go up to whoever's standing on top of that ground. Now, why did they do this? So the Mishnah continues, the Masechtas Para, because they would bring pregnant women over there to that courtyard. The Yaldasham, they would give birth over there. And why? Megadlas b'neim sham para. They would bring up children for the paraduma. Why is that? So there's a Mishnah Masechtas Para that says the kohen who would burn the paraduma, they actually made him tamei, and then they would put him into the mikveh right away. Why did they do that? They wanted to make him a full yoim, because the tzedukim, the Sadducees, they said, no, to do paraduma, you have to be like a regular Torah person, you have to have hair b'shemesh, you have to have sundown. Now, the halacha actually is that a full yoim is actually kosher at paraduma. So they specifically made him tamei. No. We're going to make him tamei. We're going to make him a full yom. That you shouldn't think that he has to be someone that has hair shemesh. Now, because they were lenient, so to speak, in the laws of tumah, they went and they doubled down everywhere else. They made many malas of tahara so that it shouldn't be disgraced. So they would be lenient to that, so be stringent. They went the other way on some other things. So everything else regarding the paraduma they did in a way of Tara. For example, all the vessels they used were clay glolam, dungware or stoneware or earthenware, that clay adama, it's not a kalatama. Now, the kohen that burnt it, who they were metame him, they made him quarantine for 7 days. His fellow kohen were not able to touch him, as we say in the beginning of Mesechtas Yoma, the Beis and Aleph, and they would spray him all 7 days with the ash of the paraduma. So one of the takanas they made was that these children should fill up the water that is used to be mekadosh the mechatas, and because of the mala, they wanted to make sure that there should be tara from all types of tumah. The Tosefta actually teaches that these children that they had were born over there in these courtyards that were not having tumas atahim, they kept them only till they're 7 or 8, and not anymore, because then they could possibly have carry. So again, they went above and beyond to try to find ways to do it in the ultimate ways of tahara. Okay, so they have these children that are growing up over there in these courtyards. And they brought oxen, meaning when they wanted to take the children to go fill up the spring water from the shalayach, which was the spring, they would bring oxen, and on the oxen they put doors, because they wanted to make an oil to be mafsik between any tumah that would be beneath the child. And the children would be sitting on these doors, and they had stone cups in their hands, because like we said, all their actions they did with the paraduma was with stoneware, which is not makabel tumah. Now, when they came to the spring of the shalayach, the children would go into the spring, they would fill up the water, because this Tana holds that when you fill up the water, it has to be actively with yourself. It can't be that you just lower down a rope, because that would obviously be the best ideal way not to become tummy. But as Rashi explains, this time held that you had to go down and do it yourself. But all of the Yeshalim, they got back onto the cow, and then they went back and they brought back the waters. That's how the Tana Kama holds. V'yisem says, no, he held that you didn't have to go down and do it with yourself. The kid would stay on the back of the ox. He would lower down a rope with the bucket, and he would fill it up that way. But they care about time because maybe here, right here in the shalayach, maybe there's a dead person over here, and the child's going to become tummy. So he would stay on the back of the ox, and he would just lower down the bucket, and he would draw it up like that. Now, title in the Brisa, he says, it's not true, they didn't bring any doors. They only stayed on the ox. Now, because the stomach, the back of the ox, not very wide, so children could sit on it, and the stomach would be mafsik. So, anyways, if there's tumah beneath, the child's not going to be mal and have as if he's over the ground. You don't need a door. You had just the oxen. Now, later on, the Gemara is going to explain why didn't they bring doors according to him, but they only used the oxen. This is where the Gemara concludes the question. So this is Rabbi Huda, who we discussed from the previous stuff, that he said that oil, if it wasn't man-made, is not considered an oil. Says the Gemara, what are you talking about? Vashvarim, but here you're talking about oxen, the oil shein also the Adam who, that's an oil, so to speak. That's like a tent that's from the ox's back, which is not man-made, it's from Hashem. The Ketani B'Hidoyim man, still we learn in the Brisa, B'Hidah says, that they didn't bring doors, they only brought oxen. So obviously you see that according to Rabbi Yehuda, that the spine of an ox, which is like a roof, and you have the chalal, the gap of the animal, is an oil that's separating, even though it's not man-made. So that contradicts what we said from Yehuda on the previous stuff. So says the Gemara, when Avdim became a sin named Rabbi Lazar, then Moed Rabbi Yehuda, although Rabbi Yehuda says that if something's not man-made, it cannot be an oil, he agrees, Kimaloi Egrev. When you have an oil that's as wide as a fist, which is more than a handbreadth, that there Rabbi Yehuda agrees that even though it's not man-made, it is considered to be an oil. Now, as Rashi says, as we find the halacha of Maloi Egrev, of a fistful, which is significant for like a skylight, which if it's not man-made, it's still going to be considered significant, as the Mishnah teaches in the Olis, in the 13th parak, the Mecharis is brought in the Pamsai and the Beis, that a ma'or, a skylight, which is not man-made, has the share of taking out tumah if it's Maloi Egrev. Now Rashi points out, it's not a regular person's fist. We're talking about the fist of Ben Avatiach, who he was like a huge person, which is like actually the size of a head of a regular person. So when did Rabbi Yehuda say in the Mishnah Ma'alois and that we quoted in the previous daf, that if it's not man-made, it's not an oil, that's if it's only a tefach, a handbreadth. But if it's the size of a person's head, then Rabbi Yehuda would agree, as we see here, what we quoted now from this brisa, that the shvarim, which are kamalai egrif, and it's even more than that, it would be considered as an oil even though it's not man-made. And Tanamach is similar in the Brisa that a Rabbi Yehuda agrees, bashkifin, which is when you have these rocks that fall out, and they get dislodged from the wind, and there's these huge gaps where it fell out from, as this picture illustrates over here. He agrees in the shkifin, uben the kikyaslam, which is when there's a crack in the rock itself, that he agrees that there it's going to be considered as an oil even though it's not man-made. Why? Because it's bigger than that of a malay egref, and therefore, although it's not man-made, it's only when it's a tefach that he holds it has to be man-made. But when it's a malay egref, he agrees. Now the Gemara asks, says, wait a second. Very delis, but the door, the yesh b'kama egrefim, there's many fistfuls from the ground up until the door that the child is sitting on. And in the Brisa, the Rebbe says, that they didn't bring doors, they only brought oxen. Where the Gemara's assumption of the question is that, because that's not the way a normal oil is. So if that's the case, then for sure oxen. In other words, seemingly, that if there's many agrafim, it should be an oil standing by a door. So why is he saying that they didn't have the door? What do you mean? What's the problem? Is the many agrafim, there shouldn't be any difference between the ox and the door. Why didn't they bring doors according to Yehuda? So the Gemara has two approaches. Amabai, it says, all Yehuda is saying is they didn't have to bring doors because the ox itself was going to function as an oil. Rav Amei says, no, they specifically did not want to bring doors. Now, not because it's not an oil. You're right, it's an oil because if it has many agrafim, even if it's not man-made, for sure the door here where it was deliberately put there should be considered as man-made. No, rather the reason is what happens is the child, he becomes very comfortable because he's not afraid to fall off if there's going to be a door. He's going to be very confident, as if he's like on a smooth surface. And the problem is, so then he might stick his head out or one of his limbs out of the door, and tell the kids, keep your head inside the window, don't stick it out, right? Or something might happen, but he feels very comfortable. So he might stick it out and he's going to be malo betuma. Therefore they brought oxen without any doors where he's afraid to fall off. He's not going to stick his head out from the width of the ox, and because if he would, then the tameh as a getintim bays, the kevat time. He might go ahead and have a tumah of a suffix, maybe of a grave. That is why they didn't bring the doors. And they didn't want the doors. Because again, he's going to be too comfortable with the doors and he's going to lean over, and that's the whole purpose, that he shouldn't be leaning over any tumah. I think Marcus Tanik can say that up. We have a Bryce that says like Rabbi. The Rabbi Shloimy says, they wouldn't bring doors at all. Why? Because the child's going to be very confident. He's going to stick his head out or one of his limbs. He's that kid who can't sit still in class, and he's going to be sticking his head out. And he's going to come tummy from the kevatayim. Rather, they brought the Egyptian oxen. That their stomachs, their backs are very wide. But the children would sit on them, but they would have these stone cups in their hands. When they reached the shalayach, that spring, Yerdu Malam, then they would go down, they would fill up the water, and they would go back and sit on the backs of that oxen. So again, that tells us why Yehuda held that they didn't want the doors. But then the Gemara asks, and this is where it relates back to halacha of our Mishnah, why we introduced this whole discussion in the first place. But a bed, the yeshbokama greifim, there's many fistfuls from the ropes of the bed down to the ground. But now, we learned in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yomi says, Rabbi Yehuda says, we always used to, we would always sleep underneath the bed in front of the elders. And obviously we see that a temporary structure is not an oil, even though there's many agrafim. So how can you say that if there's many agrafim, it doesn't make a difference what type of oil it is? Still, it's going to be an oil, even though it's not man-made. So here also, where if it's for sure man-made, why is it any different than the case of, let's say we said the delis, which Rebuta says if you don't need the delis, we don't want it for a different reason, but why here, underneath the bed, are you allowed to sleep? It has many agrafim. It has many agrafim. We said even an inferior type of oil is going to be an oil. Like I said, when there's not any adam, see here also that even though it's an oil arai of a bed, but how could you say that you're allowed to sleep underneath the bed. So the Gemara, no, Shani Mita, a bed is different because a bed is meant to sleep on top of the bed, not underneath the bed. So that's why it's not going to have a name of an oil. And yeah, it's even though it has many agrafim from the floor to the top of the bed, that's not going to give it a designation as an oil because it's not meant for that part of it. But then the Gemara says, I understand. Oxen also are meant for the top of the ox, not the bottom of the ox. So how could you say that it's an oil to separate from the child, from the tumah that's beneath him when he's going to go to the spring? But it shouldn't be as an oil. Just like a bed beneath it is not an oil, so too the ox also beneath it should not be an oil. Says the Gemara, no, when Rabin came, says Shani Shvar, I'll tell you why. Oxen are different, that the bottom of them is considered an oil, because it protects on the shepherds that they stick their head beneath the bellies of the oxen. In the summertime because of the heat, in the rainy season because of the rain. So you have the shepherd, and he goes and he lays down underneath the fat ox, and therefore because of that, it is considered an oil. Says, if that's the case, then the bed also has that same quality. The bed also protects for your shoes and your sandals that you put beneath it, which interestingly, Rashi says the reason why by a bed we said that the function of it is shoes and for sandals, because the Gemara says in Bava Basra, what's considered a bed of a Talmud Chacham? If he only has beneath his bed shoes in the summer and the sandals in the winter, where they put it over there when they go to sleep and they lay down, so he takes off his shoes and they put it beneath his bed. But to put all other chazarai underneath his bed, that's a genai, that's disgraceful, because then everyone's going to come, Tati's bed has underneath all the Mike and Ikes and all the whatever. You can't, everyone's going to be coming over there, that's where he keeps all the stuff. That's not appropriate. But one thing is that it's functions for the minolim and the sandalim. So then it should have the same quality as the oxen that you're saying it's oil because it protects underneath the shepherds. It also protects the person's shoes and sandals. So Elam Rabba says a different pshat. It says Shani Shvar. Oxen are different. The reason why that's considered an oil underneath is Hoil Ba'asuyim, since it's made that the roof of the spine of the animal is Lahagin al B'nei Ma'ayim. It protects for its intestines, its internal organs. Like it says the pasuk in ear. Skin and flesh he clothes me. And with bones and tendons he is seichecheni. He covers me. So obviously we see that the spine, the bones are considered like a schach for the bones. Which Taisa points out, although this pasuk actually talking about man, for sure by an animal it's going to be considered as an oil because an animal actually goes on all fours. So actually his belly, his spine is actually like an actual roof. It's horizontal, not vertical. So that's one pshat why an animal is going to be considered as an oil, because the pasuk calls it an oil. It calls it taseicheni, in contrast to underneath the bed. Yeah, the hell you could sleep underneath the bed because it's not considered an oil. Ovi, but you say, but if you want, you could say another pshat. That actually, according to Rabbi Yehuda, a bed is an oil. And that's why it's no different than the ox, which underneath it is considered oil. So what's the reason that Rabbi said in our Mishnah, which opened up this parak of Yoshin Tachas Amita, that you're allowed to sleep underneath a bed inside a sukkah? Says the Gemara, because Rabbi Yehuda goes according to his reasoning. The moment that he says, Sukkah, diris kevabina, the sukkah has to be a permanent structure. Mita diris arai. Now, a bed is definitely a temporary structure because beds are movable. This sukkah el keva. So you have a sukkah that's a permanent structure. You cannot have a temporary structure of a bed nullifying the permanent structure to remove the title of a sukkah from here. And therefore, although you're underneath the bed, that doesn't make it like you're underneath the bed, not underneath the sukkah, because the more permanent structure is that of the sukkah. So it's not like you're under the bed, you're still going to be in the sukkah. The problem with this is, says the Gemara, because Rabbi Shimon, the Amanam is sukkah diris kevabin, he also tells us that you need to have a permanent sukkah. Where we find it, he says you need to have 4 walls, not 3 like we say. He also has to have, we say you have to have 2 and a tefach. He says you have to have 3 and a tefach. You have to have 4 walls. Now the Gemara said in the first parak of Zayin Vei, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. So those are the 2 Tanaim we're discussing over here. Rabbi Eliel, Rabbi Eliezer, and the Achim. They all hold sukkah has to be a Jewish kavah. Now, in our Mishnah, we quoted that according to our understanding of what Rabbi Shimon was saying, that we said that whoever sleeps underneath a bed has not fulfilled his obligation, because he said, oh, Tavi Avdi, my slave Tavi, he slept underneath the bed, which was obviously showing that because he's an Eved, but everyone else cannot sleep underneath the bed. But problem is, but he holds you have to have a permanent structure as a sukkah. That's why you have to have 4 walls. So why does he say that you cannot sleep beneath the bed? He should hold like a Yehuda, because oil arai cannot be vatal ol keva. So why does he disagree and hold that you cannot sleep beneath the bed? Says yeah, this is exactly what they're disagreeing about. Marsa Rabbi Shimon holds asi oil arai vatal ol keva. Yeah, that a temporary structure could nullify your permanent structure. It doesn't make a difference that this is arai and this is keva. Unless you're in the oil arai, you're underneath the bed, you're not in the sukkah. No, a temporary structure that you're in will not nullify the permanent structure, and therefore that's where they have this machlekes exactly on this point. So you're right; they both hold that the sukkah is ol keva. Machlekes is underneath the bed, which oil arai is that mabatul ol keva or not. Now, in the Mishnah we had said, Rabbi Shimon says, "Ma'isa b'tavi avdei." He said a story with his slave Tavi, which we just referenced right now, which that we had said in the Mishnah. From there we learned that an eved is not mechuyev in the mitzvah, and also that a regular person cannot sleep near the bed. Now, Tanya learned in the Brisa a slightly different wording of our Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon, he says misichase shel Rabbi Gamliel, from the regular mundane words of Rabbi Gamliel from the Shmuzim. Lemanu shnei dvarim, we learned 2 things. First of all, lemanu we learned shabbadim b'turmin minasukah, that a slave is exempt from sukkah, which Tosfos points out, why would you have to say that as a chiddush? It's a mitzvah cessation, it's a time-bound positive commandment, which avadim are just like women, of course they're pater. So he says, no, we have to say, because later on the parak of Chav Chesem Abeis, we're going to say that it says, Teshu came to do, you have to live in the sukkah as you do in your house. And just like in your house you have your evet, so too you think in the sukkah you have to have your evet too, then we have to tell you that no, that the evet is pater in the sukkah. And second of all, we learn from that also that we learn someone sleeps beneath the bed, he has not fulfilled his obligation, because he was saying my slave Tavi is very smart, which means to say that only because the Evid, but Evid is really pater, and that a regular person cannot sleep beneath the sukkah. But the Gemara asked on the wording, why don't you say midvav shugim lil? Why are you saying misichasai from like his shmuzing? Why don't you say from his words? Says the Gemara, milsa, a new thing, agav urche, parenthetically, that we're coming to tell you these 2 things that we learned. Kamash Malan, we're coming to tell you that in the wording that you could learn out a new chiddush, because had we said midvarav, so you wanted to learn out anything from the way we're extrapolating that if something he's just talking his mundane words, that you have to pay attention to learn it. But now we're actually teaching you kihadam rabach bar adam. Some say it was amar Rav Acha bar Ada amar Rav Hamnuna amar Rav. That even if a Talmid Chacham is just schmoozing, he's just talking, you have to listen, pay attention, because you have to learn from what he's saying. Like it says the pasuk in Tehillim, Alehu, and its leaves, meaning something insignificant, like just the leaves of a tree, Layibol, which this is a metaphor for a Talmid Chacham, will not wither, which is to say, you have to lean over and pay attention. Even for the shmuzing, because even that at the end you're going to understand some words of Torah, you're going to understand to learn out something else from that. And that's what we're saying, misichasai. That's why the wording was from the sichasai shemulil. We learned that 2 halachas, because even though you're just shmuzing, but the chasidim are there bending over trying to listen, because even when they're just shmuzing, you're going to learn out great words of Torah. That's what we want to teach you from those words of saying sichasai and not devarim.
What's the chiddush of Hashem and Sukkah?
Right, so he says that because you would have thought Teshu came to do, which is at the end of the parak, that just like you sleep in your house with your wife and your slave, you would think also that in the sukkah also it's a chiv and Teshu came to do. That's a saying that no, that the evidence is pater and it doesn't have to sleep in the sukkah. Now we continue the halacha, the next Mishnah, continuing on the halachas of the schach and the sukkah. This halacha is supporting. Hasoymech, someone leans sukkasa, his sukkah, bekari hamita, on the frame of a bed. Like this picture is literally, you take a bed frame and you put schach on top of that. So the Tanna Kama says, so share it's going to be kosher, because a bed could be, as long as you have kosher schach, the beds, the walls could be whatever it wants to be. It could be davar makabel tama. Yehuda, however, he says, but if the sukkah cannot be supported on itself without the bed, then still it's going to be invalid. The Gemara is going to explain what's the reason for this halacha of Rabbi Yehuda, as the Gemara says right now. My time is Rabbi Yehuda. What's the reason of Rabbi Yehuda? Why would it be possible? So plika about Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Amram, Rabbi Amram. It's actually a machlekes amiram about the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda. Chadama one says, "Mnei she'en lo keva." It's not permanent because it's movable with the bed. Now, this is Rabbi Yehuda l'shitasa, as we just quoted earlier before, that he says the sukkah has to be diris keva, has to have permanence. If it's on the bed is a movable thing, so this sukkah has no permanence whatsoever. It's not going to qualify as a valid sukkah. Chadam, the other one says a very different reason. Because you're supporting the sukkah with something that's makabel tumah. Now, as Rashi points out, although we don't learn a psul, the invalidation of makabel tumah only for schach, as we learned out from Sir's Gurm B'Yekev, which it's just there that the schach, but since the primary support of the schach is this bed, it's as if you made the schach with something that's makabel tumah. That's the Amoira's interpretation of Rabbi Yehuda's halacha when he held that it's going. Tanakh obviously doesn't agree with that, but that's what Rabbi Yehuda held that it's going to be possible. Says my bad. What's the difference between these two interpretations? If it's because it doesn't have permanence or because it's something that's makabel tumah. If you're going, for example, shena'at, where he stuck into the ground shvun shel basel, spits of iron, and he went and he made a schach on top of them, meaning four poles of the. I mean, you could have regular walls or whatever the walls that you want it to be, but you make 4 spits of iron and you make the schach on top of them. Lamanda Amar Lafisha and Lekeva, according to the one that says because there's no permanence, Harish Lekeva, there is permanence now, even though it's made out of metal, but it has permanence. According to the one that says that no, because you're supporting the schach with something that's makabel tumah, you're supporting it with something that's makabel tumah, and therefore it would be possible according to that interpretation. Now, one more important qualification is halacha Rabbi Yehuda Amar Abaye says lo shanu ela samach, as the wording was in our Mishnah. We only said if you're supporting the sukkah on this thing that's makabel tumah, like the case of the Mishnah, which regarding the bed frame of a sichach al gav hamitam. But let's say you just put the schach on top of the bed, as Rashi explains. You're actually not supporting the schach on the bed frame. Actually, you're supporting the schach on pegs that is kosher for the sukkah. But the walls of the sukkah are made out of the beds from all 3 sides. That says Abaya, so like shiur. There, Rabbi Yehuda would not say it's going to be invalid. My time, what's the reason? So he says, could both reasonings we said will not qualify in this case? According to the one that says Lafisha and Lekeva, because there's no permanence. Harish Lekeva. There is permanence for this sukkah because it's being supported by things that are not on the bed. The bed is just the walls. And according to the one that says that the case of our Mishnah was invalid because it's being supported with something that's makabel tumah, he's not supporting with something that's makabel tumah because we don't learn out the psul of the sukkah only for the schach. And this thing in the bed frame is neither the schach and it's not being maimed. It's just taking up the space of the walls itself. So it's just on it. But what's actually supporting it is actually kosher pegs, things that are not makabel tumah, and therefore, in this case, everyone would agree that even Rabbi Yehuda would agree that it's going to be kosher and it wouldn't be possible. And again, this is the famous shmuz in halacha, but of makabel tumah being minded, where Taisa actually means a different interpretation from the Yerushalmi, which actually in halacha they paskin like that. That's about because there's no space of 10 tefachim, but still there's baf, that's where you get the chazon, you get all the things that are maimed b'dav makabel tumah. But according to the primary halacha, that we actually we paskin like a Yehuda, but that the halacha is of the halacha of keva, and the Taisus brings from the Yishalmi what that is. But again, that's this shmuz of this sugi over here. Thank you for any time, fellows.